The final item of business today is members' business debate on motion 20652 in the name of Brian Whittle on future options for South West Scotland transport infrastructure. And this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Brian Whittle to open the debate for around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to bring this debate back to the Chamber, because it's a long-standing debate that has been well rehearsed by many of the protagonists across the Chamber many times. In many ways, it's a fairly unique debate in that everyone basically knows what everyone else is going to say. In the Cabinet Secretary's absence, I am assuming that the Minister will already have stacked up his rebuttals. He will no doubt throw in some well-rehearsed lines to try and muddy the waters a bit. We'll probably hear the words Brexit. I'm quite sure the Tories will definitely come into it through gritted teeth. And I'm quite sure the maintenance spend on these routes will be quoted. However, none of that will change the fact that when it comes to infrastructure spend by the Scottish Government, in the last decade it has allocated a mere 0.4% of infrastructure spend to the South West, and that includes the £30 million Maybole bypass currently being constructed after a 60-year campaign. Even with this, the Government managed to miss the opportunity to future-proof this road by only agreeing to build a single road rather than a stretch of dual carriageway. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm sure my colleagues will no doubt discuss their own patches in the South West and highlight the issues their constituents face as a result of the continuing lack of investment in the area. What this will surely highlight is the scale of the problem that the Scottish Government have created for themselves by continually ignoring the South West. The road and rail infrastructure now requires a complete overhaul, with the A77, the A76, the 75 and the 70, as well as the Belfield interchange creaking under the weight of traffic that none of them were designed for. The rail link from Ayr to Stranraer is a single track served with ageing diesel trains. And then there is the ongoing issue with the Ayr Station Hotel, which has already caused huge disruption to my constituents south of the station when it caused the closure of that rail link. The hotel issue remains unresolved and the cost to the taxpayer continues to rise. The railway does need an upgrade, with the potential for electrification or alternative fuel trains, with a spur off to Cairnryan to potentially take away some of the road traffic. If we actually look at the Belfield interchange at Kilmarnock, which is an elevated roundabout carrying traffic on and off the A77, it links to North Ayrshire, with over 40% of traffic going to North Ayrshire passing through this roundabout. It links the A76 to Cumnock and Dumfries, as well as the A71 east to Lanarkshire, Edinburgh and the M74. Transport Scotland have raised concerns about the interchange's ability to deal with the additional traffic resulting from the Ayrshire Growth Deal investment. Now, Minister, I know you're going to hide behind the STPR2 report and the recommendations, but these issues are not new. They have been building for decades, and I note that my colleague John Scott in Portfolio Questions, who has been dealing with these issues for far longer than I, asked about the parts of the A77 in his constituency that were supposed to be upgraded in the original STPR report years ago, and these have remained unfulfilled. And if proof was required about the way in which the Scottish Government have disregarded the needs of the South West, we only need to look at their response to the A73 Rest and Be Thankful's most recent landslip. Whatever it needs, I heard from the Cabinet Secretary, he'll have a solution on the table by February. There was a landslip just a mile from the Stena port that shut a lane for 4.5 years. When the then Cabinet Secretary was finally pressured into dealing with it, it was sorted in 3 months. The Scottish Government have not been alive to the needs of the South West, or they've just been ignoring them. I have to say, Deputy Presiding Officer, I had hoped to try and be somewhat conciliatory in this speech, but having taken part in the Portfolio Questions earlier today, it was obvious to me that Mr Matheson still prefers politicking to actually taking any positive action or responsibility. I think his response to my question on the loss of business from the Cairnryan-Belfast route to the Dublin-Heysham or Liverpool route, I thought was nothing short of disgraceful. Rather than suggesting I was talking down the South West, perhaps you could do a little bit of homework by speaking to the ferry operators, or the Belfast Harbour, or the Belfast politicians, or the hauliers in Scotland and Belfast, as I have done, If he had done that, he would know there is a drift away from the Belfast-Cairnryan route to the Dublin routes, so far totalling 6%. That is a fact, Deputy Presiding Officer. So either the Cabinet Secretary doesn't actually know the facts or he's trying to cover them up, neither of which is a good look for a Cabinet Secretary. I would say to him, if he was here, if he has decided that coming to this chamber and deploying feigned indignation in this way to avoid facing facts, can I say to him, he should then expect to be dragged back into this chamber over and over until he actually listens to the concerns of the people in the South West, because they deserve better than what he offered today. In 2010, the then First Minister, Alex Salmond, committed to upgrading the South West infrastructure in and out of the port of Cairnryan while opening up the port, acknowledging that the £340 million investment by Stena and P&O. In 2011, Alex Neil, the then Cabinet Secretary for Transport, said it was a disgrace that the previous Labour administration had not invested in infrastructure upgrades in the South West, after which the Scottish Government proceeded to do nothing to rectify the situation. In 2016, at the start of this parliamentary term, John Swinney and Humza Yousaf, the then Transport Cabinet Secretary, held a fact-finding session with over 150 representatives from the South West business community. But much talk, no action resulted. Even Michael Matheson himself has come down to listen to the concerns. The asks are simple. The South West needs a 10-year or so infrastructure development strategy. That has to include roads and rail connections, the infrastructure potential for electric charging points in the bypass towns, a cycle route from Ayr to Stranraer passing through the bypass towns, the potential for a whole new economy. And I think these asks from the constituency are reasonable, Deputy Presiding Officer. 10 years of warm words and empty promises. From Alex Salmond a decade ago through Alex Neil and Humza Yousaf, warm words have been spoken about developing the infrastructure in the South West, all the while finding a way to kick the can down the road for the next Cabinet Secretary to deal with. I would say to the Minister, as you're now in the hot seat, be different. Break the cycle. You know that the South West has been ignored for far too long. You know that its connectivity has been chronically underfunded for decades. This actually shouldn't be a political fight between you and I. I ask you to take the opportunity this evening, do the right thing, and finally commit to the Scottish Government to invest a fair share, because that's all we're asking for, a fair share of the transport infrastructure budget to the South West that is owed and is desperately needed. Please stop ignoring the South West and give us the chance to grow and prosper. Deputy Presiding Officer.
We move to the open debate. Can I have speeches of 4 minutes, please? John McAlpine, followed by Graeme Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. When I last spoke about the South West Transport in this chamber, in a debate led by my colleague Emma Harper, MSP, I mentioned that in 2016 I called for a transport summit to be held in Dumfries to ensure that our local priorities were heard by national decision makers. I did that because I had discovered that the local transport plan for several years before had identified a number of road improvements, particularly on the A75, and every single one of them had been completed. So we needed to update our priorities. Road upgrades are very major capital investments, as are most transport upgrades, and they have a big impact on local communities. So a great deal of systematic advanced planning and evidence gathering has to be done. So I knew it was important to make sure that Dumfries and Galloway was included when the government was revising the Strategic Transport Projects Review that will identify the priorities for the next 20 years. The Transport Summit was attended by the then Minister and his senior officials, and it put the South West very much on the radar. It means that the needs of South Scotland will be considered in the Strategic Transport Projects Review too, notwithstanding the changes that have taken place since 2016, which will impact on our thinking, first being the pandemic and its economic impact, and then the very real danger of a no-deal Brexit, and of course, the declaration of a climate emergency, which was supported across the Parliament and which has an influence on how we think about our transport priorities. The Transport Summit led to the consultant's report, the South West Scotland Transport Study, the initial appraisal case for change, which was published in January this year and which will inform STPR2. The appraisal report is a key milestone in getting us closer to the improvements that we all want to see. And I want to take issue with Brian Whittle's suggestion that the South West is ignored. The South West has its own enterprise agency launched in the middle of the pandemic this year, which is doing a huge amount of work in the South West already and shows the priority that the South has in this government's agenda. To return to transport, I want to talk a little bit about the recommendations in that very important appraisal, which I particularly approve of. That would be new rail stations on the Glasgow South Western line, such as Cumnock, Thornhill, Eastriggs, new railway stations on the West Coast Main Line, namely BTUC, something that I've campaigned for a number of years. Also improved services on the West Coast Main Line, including through Lockerbie. But of course, these services are regulated by the UK government, and despite much lobbying on my part, I've found the UK government hasn't been particularly helpful in improving those services. I welcome the recommendation that further work is to be done on looking at a new rail link between Dumfries and Stranraer, something that was closed in the 1960s and would be very popular if it was restored. However, we know that that would be, if it was taken forward, astronomically expensive, although given the climate crisis, such a project would send a strong message about this government's priorities. I also welcome mention in Brian Whittle's motion of electric vehicles and believe that the recommended enhancements in the capacity for charging, which is a big commitment of the Scottish Government, complements some of the recommendations of the appraisal report, that notably the capacity enhancements in the A75, A77 and A76. I particularly welcome those recommendations, and the other recommendation which says there should be road capacity enhancements between Dumfries and the A74, such as dualling, and the possibility to reclassify the status of the 701 and 709. Dumfries is the capital of the South, and it should have effective links to the rest of Scotland, and I've campaigned for that for many years. And I believe our long-term ambition should be to dual the A75, given its status as a Euro route linking Scotland and Ireland. So, in conclusion, I look forward to future work being done on these options so they become national priorities for Scotland. This is the correct way to set transport priorities. It's the systematic way, it's the responsible way to do these things, and it contrasts markedly with the ridiculous headline-grabbing comments by UK ministers on tunnels or bridges to Larne. Let's get our priorities right. These madcap suggestions have not been researched, they've not been evaluated, and they've not been tested or evidenced. They're not the priorities of the people of South West of Scotland. They are, in fact, the feeble effort of a UK government desperate to divert attention from its deep unpopularity and incompetence. Thank you.
Can I ask remaining members in the debate to try and stick to 4 minutes, please? Graeme Simpson to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank Brian Whittle for bringing this debate to the Chamber? His helpful motion is almost as long as the transport study it refers to. Mr Whittle is not known for his brevity. He has a lot to say on many things and sometimes is worth listening to. I have listened to him talking about transport in the South West on many occasions. He's passionate about it. Actually, he's annoyed about it, and he's right to be. The South West has been the poor relation when it comes to investment in transport infrastructure for too long. The report makes for grim reading. This is a forgotten about region, too easily bypassed by travellers as they head north or south, and by government. The main roads that they have are slow. That leads to often long lines of traffic, leading to risky manoeuvres and more serious accidents than elsewhere in the country. To quote from the report, an assessment of average speeds on the strategic road network compared to other routes in Scotland identified that the A77 between Ayr and Cairnryan had the lowest overall speeds, 38 miles an hour, of all the routes assessed, which is likely to be a result of the large number of speed-limited settlements which the route passes through. While the speed on the A75 is higher, 45 miles an hour, it is still below other strategic routes in the country. The poor rail connections from Dumfries mean people drive elsewhere, particularly Lockerbie, which causes problems there. And the report references large gaps in the rail timetable and between direct services on the Glasgow South Western line for Stranraer, which can constrain use of the rail network. All this means that there is, quotes, a reluctance for individuals and businesses to invest in the region, particularly the ports, if connectivity with other parts of the UK is not improved. And speaking of ports, this is the area that you have to go to if you want to get to Ireland, unless you want to sail from England. It's vital for trade, and the two roads that get you to the ports, the A75 and the A77, are in desperate need of improvement, and I'm backing the campaigns to upgrade both and quickly. Buses are also poor, with ageing vehicles and infrequent services. The Chamber will know that I enjoy cycling. The pandemic has led to an increase in cycling, and that's great, but we can only build on that if we make it safe. The report says the cycling infrastructure in the South West has a long way to go, with a lack of off-road and segregated routes. These are absolutely essential if we're to build on some of the excellent work being done by councils during the pandemic. But where there are problems, there are opportunities too. And let's agree that we want investment in our connections to Ireland. Let's agree with the 5 objectives laid out in the report. Reduce journey times across the strategic transport network in the area to the ports at Kenryan. Reduce accident rates and the severity of accidents on the trunk road network. Improve the resilience of the strategic transport network. Improve journey quality across the road, public transport and active travel networks in the South West. And finally, improve connectivity across all modes for communities to key economic, education, health and cultural centres, including Glasgow, Edinburgh, Ayr, Kilmarnock and Carlisle. Agree with those aims, get on with it and put the South West back on the map.
Emma Harper, please, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank Brian Whittle on bringing this debate forward. There is an urgent and very real need for major investment and improvements in the South West Scotland's transport system. And I agree with lots of the examples that Mr Whittle has described. And there is cross-party support for infrastructure investment in the South West. Firstly, I want to highlight the importance of the region's road, rail, bus and active travel routes, not only to many businesses and communities across the South West who rely on them, but for daily business, but also the wider Scottish, UK and international community. The Cairnryan port in Dumfries and Galloway is the 3rd busiest port in the whole of the UK. Official estimates suggest that 20 million passengers and over 2 million tonnes of freight units they travel through the port on our region's roads. The freight has an estimated value of £26 million every single day on the A75 and £10 million a day on the A77. And with Brexit looming, we may see even more lorries on the road with even more delays. And delays pose a particular problem for livestock transport, refrigerated lorries and live seafood being shipped. I know that port investment is a matter reserved to Westminster, and instead of talking about investing in the port, the Prime Minister is still talking about building a ridiculous bridge through the munitions dump in Beaufort's Dyke in the Irish Sea. Presiding, actually, yes, I will. A quick one, please.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank Emma Harper for taking the intervention. I'm just confused why she's so adamantly opposed to scoping out a project that could benefit our region. I think that there are other projects we all want to see happen, but it doesn't mean we should dismiss this one out of hand before the feasibility work is done.
I'll give you the time back, Ms Harper.
Thank you. I never said I was opposed to scoping exercise. What I do think they need to do, if there is any scoping exercise, they need to consider the communities, elected members and the people either side of the port infrastructure, including the folk that live along the A75 and the 77. We know that, Presiding Officer, in August 2018, I invited the Transport Secretary for a meeting in Stranraer. He was new in post at that time. And we met with stakeholders and others to discuss improvements to the region's transport network. It was a very positive meeting. Last year, I took the Stena ferry to Northern Ireland and the P&O ferry back. And while in Belfast and in Larne, I met with key stakeholders involved with the haulage industry, Stena Line, P&O, Belfast Harper, the North Irish Chamber of Commerce and lobbying groups. This trip was extremely educational and productive. I agreed at these meetings to continue to work with members across the Chamber, the Scottish Government, local constituents and the A75 and A77 action groups to ensure additional investment for our region. I appealed to the Scottish Government to commit to ensuring both the Cairnryan port and, importantly, the associated transport routes, the 75 and the 77, are prioritised and invested in. Presiding Officer, I know that over the last 10 years, £810.5 million has been invested by the Scottish Government in transport infrastructure in the South West, with almost £50 million on the A75 projects and £28 million for A77 projects, and £76 million and £56 million for maintenance on both roads respectively. This is a welcome investment. I also welcome the South West Transport Study and its suggestions of actual investment in dualling or passing lane improvements for both the 75 and the 77, as well as improved new rail and bus services. I'm concerned, as are constituents, over the time frame for improvements to be implemented. And I would therefore be grateful if the Minister could outline timescales for the next steps on when the wider STPR2 is likely to be published. Presiding Officer, constituents have contacted me about the need for further electric charging points across Dumfries and Galloway for cars, bikes and other active travel methods. And I know that that was in the motion by Brian Whittle. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would ask the Minister to outline whether he has held any discussions or whether the Cabinet Secretary has with D&G Council about further electric charging points and whether there are any plans for further upgrades to active travel and green travel infrastructure. I would ask the Minister to set out timescales for transport improvements on the 75 and 77 and for the region's transport services. This is vitally important to our region.
Colin Smith, followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I declare an interest as the chairperson of the Eastriggs Railway Station Action Group? Can I also thank Brian Whittle for his motion? As Brian Whittle said, this isn't the first time we've debated South West Scotland's infrastructure, and frankly, it won't be the last, because there is a real feeling, a real growing anger, in fact, that the South West is the forgotten region of Scotland when it comes to investing in infrastructure. And no wonder, of the £10.5 billion of spending on road upgrades by the Scottish Government since 2008, just £70 million has been invested in the South West. And now there is a genuine worry that the emphasis in the Government's National Transport Strategy and draft infrastructure plan on repurposing what we have after the Government have committed to spending £3 billion during the A9 in the north, but not a penny more on roads in the South West, will mean the region will lose out once again. And if it does, we will continue not only with a substandard infrastructure, but it will weaken what is already a fragile local economy. Because, Presiding Officer, this isn't just an issue about roads or in fact any other form of transport. It is fundamentally an issue about the economy. The Scottish Government say it's committed to inclusive growth, and it's one of its central aims in its economic strategy published in 2015. But there's nothing inclusive about a Scottish economy where the South has the lowest wages, the lowest levels of business-led inclusive jobs growth, the lowest GVA in Scotland, and where the outward migration of young people caused by the lack of high-skill, high-paid jobs is draining away the talent, the very lifeblood we need to turn the economy around. Last year, the Scottish Government's own commissioned report for the South of Scotland Economic Partnership, The Good Economy, highlighted that the top call from local experts in the South of Scotland to unlock inclusive economic growth in the South's rural economy was better connectivity, both physical with better transport and digital with fit-for-purpose broadband and mobile communications. And that means when it comes to transport, we need proper investment in our trunk roads such as the A7 and A76 in the east, and the A75 and the A77, which are of crucial strategic importance, not just to the southwest of Scotland, but to all of Scotland, the north of England and Northern Ireland. We've heard much this week, and it's been mentioned in the debate, about the UK Government's review of transport connections across the UK, and Boris Johnson's, frankly, fantasy politics with talk of a bridge or tunnel between Port Patrick and Larne, which everyone knows won't happen. But, Presiding Officer, we already have a link to Northern Ireland via Cairnryan Ferryport. It's not the ferries that are the problem, it's the substandard road and the rail links to get to those ferries. So my message to Boris Johnson is the same message to the Scottish Government. If you're serious about better links between Scotland and Northern Ireland, invest in dualling the A77 and A75, excuse me, and also building better rail links to the ferryport. Because whether it's better rail links to Cairnryan or a rail link between the Glasgow South Western Line in Dumfries and the West Coast Main Line at Lockerbie, or the reopening of railway stations at Eastridge, Thornhill and Beatech, or just those smaller changes such as more frequent rail service to the Central Belt and buses that actually link up with train times. We badly need an integrated transport strategy that covers roads, rail and active travel for the South West economy. That will take political leadership from the government to make it happen. But I have to say, so far the omens are not good. At a time we need a strategic active travel network in the South West, we've seen a centralisation to the cities of active travel funding. When the government announced plans for the electrification of our railways recently, they made clear the stretch from Girvan to Stranraer would miss out. And when in many parts of the South West the bus network is close to collapse, the government have shelved the implementation. I'll take an implementation if I get my time back. Yeah, sure.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Mr Smith, for taking the intervention. It's just a quick one. Does the member agree that Michael Matheson said that even though we might not electrify the line, that hydrogen-powered or other options would be considered?
Colin Smith.
He made it clear that it would be, but this is the fundamental problem. If you electrify a railway line, it shows a commitment in the long term to that line. If you don't do it, then frankly it's very easy to remove the battery-operated trains or even the hydrogen-operated trains. And I think it shows a lack of commitment that that key stretch is not going to be completed when other parts of Scotland are seeing significant electrification across the region. And as I made the point, it's not just on rail where we're seeing a lack of commitment from the government, it's also on our bus network as well. The government have shelved the implementation of the key measures in the transport bill that the Cabinet Secretary consistently tells us are needed to boost bus passenger numbers, such as giving the councils the powers to run their own bus companies. So, Presiding Officer, the clock is ticking. We need a clear message today from the Minister that the South West will start to get a fairer share of transport investment so we can build a fairer local economy. An economy that, I have to say, cannot keep waiting for the government's delayed strategic transport projects review.
Oliver Mundell, followed by Willy Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by joining other members in thanking Brian Whittle for bringing forward this important debate. Since before I was elected and every minute since, I've been a strong advocate for dualling the A75. For my constituency, this is the single standout project that has the power to reverse the economic challenges Dumfriesshire has faced. For a national government in Scotland's national parliament to have been in power for over a decade and not have delivered on connecting Dumfries Town, our regional capital, to the motorway shows a painful lack of ambition and is a dereliction of duty. I say this, Presiding Officer, not to pit one project in the wider region against another, but to add to the list of many strong examples we've heard from across the southwest of Scotland tonight. I have also stood here in this chamber many times and raised concerns about the A76, where we saw temporary traffic lights reducing it down to a single lane for over 1,000 days. Yes, the road has eventually been realigned, but the project was given far lower priority than it might have been had it been somewhere else in the country. Personally, I'm deeply angry that after 13 years unlucky under the SNP, we now see SNP local politicians getting behind these key transport projects in an election year. Where have they been? Where have their voices been in helping hold their government to account in the last 1,500 days since the much-heralded Transport Summit held with the Deputy First Minister in Dumfries? I'll take an intervention if I get my time back.
You're all being very conditional. I'll decide who gets their time back. Emma Harper.
I have myself campaigned for improvements since I came to this place. But I was wondering if Mr Mundell can tell me if he agrees with the proposed expansion of the M8 third lane at an estimated cost of £3 to £5 billion, and whether that money will stop it being spent in the South West.
You can have your time back, Mr Mundell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'll get to that at the end of my speech because it was a predictable intervention. However it's dressed up, the Transport Summit in Dumfries was another talking shop intended to pay lip service to South West Scotland, and it was clear at the time that the chequebook had been left in Edinburgh. Another parliamentary term has passed and still we're no further forward. This is not good enough, and it's increasingly clear to me that any promises we see ahead of the election will have been as a result of Scottish Conservatives who have been proud to represent our region and put pressure on this government.
Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank the member for taking intervention. I presume that Mr Mundell would accept that in order to fund projects and take forward projects that we are supportive of, we need to go through the appropriate Treasury process, the Green Book appraisal, STAG process, to reach a conclusion whereby the Treasury itself would approve of us spending public money on what are, I'm sure you would agree, expensive projects. He identifies the summit, then nothing came from that. Would he then accept that the prioritisation of Dumfries and Galloway, the South West Scotland, in the process we are undertaking, the Case for Change process, is an example of us prioritising the region he cares about after that summit?
Can I just remind everybody that I'm in charge here? Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's too little, too late. And if the Scottish Government had got started on scoping out these projects the minute it got into office, if the SNP had taken these projects seriously at the time, we wouldn't be here now still talking about them. Wasted opportunity time after time. I've taken a number of interventions and I'm going to make a little bit of progress, because I also want to take this opportunity to challenge the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary, who coincidentally is not here, to ask him why he wasn't prepared to get behind the Prime Minister's planned review of inter-UK transport links. After all, if the Scottish Government cared about our region and was willing to put politics aside, they would recognise that Dumfriesshire lies at the heart of our United Kingdom, and by failing to engage in this important study, they're selling local interests short and ignoring the needs of the local economy. This is another example of the damage that the SNP's divisive politics has done, and I know that local people and residents see this for what it is. But what annoys me most of all is to hear SNP politicians and the Cabinet Secretary in the past try and claim that by supporting one project in the region, you're against other projects in the region, or that you're against projects elsewhere in Scotland. I know that the SNP are very central belt driven in their thinking, but I would remind the Cabinet Secretary, for example, when he talks about the A77, it's remembering that we're further from Annan, you're closer, to Annan in this Parliament than you are from Annan to Stranraer. That's why I find it insulting and quite frankly ridiculous to have heard him attempt to make mileage out of the fact that Douglas Ross, on a recent visit to my constituency, didn't mention the A77. That would have been quite frankly strange. Let me be clear to Emma Harper and others, the Scottish Conservatives don't see investment as an either-or. We don't see it as a choice between the Central Belt and our region, nor do we see it as a choice between the A75 and the A77. Ultimately, after 13 years of being the forgotten region under the SNP, the only choice, either-or choice, that local people will have to make is between those representatives who champion the region all the time and those who make promises when they're asking for people's votes.
OK, we've all been having such a good time in this debate that we're running out of time. So I am minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 814(3) to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes to allow the final speakers. And can I invite Brian Whittle to move such a motion?
Move, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. That's agreed. I now call Willy Coffey to be followed by John Scott, and that will be the last two speakers.
Presiding Officer, thank you. In welcoming the debate, it's always good to start off with some good news. In a parliamentary question I asked last year around this time, I asked how much this SNP government had actually spent on transport infrastructure in South West Scotland in the 10 years since 2009. The total was around £800 million and included major interventions in the A77 at Symington, the A75 at Dunraget and Hardgrove, as well as significant investments for the A76. The Cabinet Secretary earlier today reminded us about the £29 million being spent on the Maybole bypass. So it can be clearly seen that the level of investment in South West Scotland has been and is substantial. I'm sure members didn't intend to give a false impression about all this and seek to deflect attention away from their own failures to deliver when they had the chance. And the spend by this government compares very well with investment in previous years. When you look back into the mists of time when Labour was last in power, they managed to rustle up one project on the A75, a miserable allocation of £6 million. The Scottish Government has already spent £36 million on that road in our first 5 years in office. Long before that, of course, before this Parliament was reconvened, the then UK Government promised much and delivered nothing. Dunraget, Bannan and Maybole all promised, but nothing happened, all done now by the SNP government. So it's little wonder that the member is pleading for more cash to be spent in the South West, presumably by the SNP, since there's little or no hope of his own party delivering anything in this part of Scotland. A cursory glance at their latest party leader's leaflet, currently littering homes, has nothing in it for South West Scotland, but it promises a ridiculous 6-lane motorway to Edinburgh, which would cost billions of pounds, and yet more rail investment to Aberdeen and Inverness, but nothing down here. So it's probably no surprise that the Tories are asking the SNP government to help, because they've got no intention of delivering anything themselves down here in South West Scotland. One area where we probably all agree on is to maximise the opportunities for trade and tourism between Scotland and Ireland, using all of our ferry ports and excellent ferry services. But with the Brexit disaster looming, Presiding Officer, there has to be some urgent clarity on the role our ports will play. Already, the Irish are intending to establish a new and direct 6 days a week ferry service from Rosslare to the European Union at Le Havre to avoid any land bridge congestion here post-Brexit. The implications of that for our ports are easy to see and should worry us all. In relation to Belfield in Kilmarnock, my constituency, the member who is an occasional visitor to my constituency should know that the interchange is included in a further programme of investigation this financial year. It will take into account emerging transport demands and safety. Finally, Presiding Officer, one major transport asset that's not been mentioned in the member's motion is Prestwick Airport. And no wonder the Tories keep quiet about it. Saved by this SNP government in 2013, 300 direct and 1,400 indirect jobs were saved too. But the incredible intervention by Tory MSP Peter Chapman, who questioned why job losses were not now happening at Prestwick when they were happening elsewhere in the aviation sector, was remarkable indeed. In addition, Ayrshire Tory councillor Tom Marshall is on record saying that Prestwick Airport should close altogether. So who needs enemies when you've got friends like that? Presiding Officer, investment in transport infrastructure in South West by this government has been excellent over recent years, and I'm sure will continue with the SNP government into the next session of the Parliament and hopefully for many years to come. Thank you.
And the last of the open debate contributions is from John Scott.
Presiding Officer, may I begin by congratulating Brian Whittle on securing this vitally important debate today for the people of South West Scotland. Can I also say what a pleasure it is to be back speaking in our Parliament, and in a strange way it feels like my maiden speech, not just because it's a long time since I've spoken in Parliament, but because my maiden speech 20 years ago was about the need to upgrade the A77. And remarkably, that work to turn the A77 into the M77 eventually happened. So I hope my wish list for today for the A77 will also turn into reality. And if I and others can persuade the Cabinet Secretary to wave his magic wand and find the funding for the much-needed improvements to this major route. And given my age and the fact that I've pretty well lived in Ayrshire all my life, I think I know the A77 as well as most of those who have spoken today. And Brian Whittle is absolutely correct to speak of the particularly dangerous stretch of road south of Ballantrae on the way to the Ayrshire county boundary with Wigtonshire. And having lived at Ballantrae for much of my life, I know of too many local people and others who've died on this stretch of road because of the shockingly poor and narrow road carriageway. And Transport Scotland and others should hang their head in shame at the desperately poor quality of the road on this section, particularly at the water tanks just south of Ballantrae. However, I also want to speak about the A77 north of and around Ayr and the need to upgrade these roads, some of which are in Jean Freeman's constituency and some of which are the shared boundary between our constituencies. And approaching Ayr constituency from the north, the M77 stops at Fenwick to the north of Kilmarnock. And I know that Kenny Gibson and I hope Willy Coffey agree with me that it's time that the M77 is extended to Ayr. With more and more people choosing to live in Ayr and the surrounding villages, daily commuter numbers to Glasgow certainly were growing year on year pre-COVID-19, and this traffic growth will, I hope, continue, albeit in electric cars in the future. Approaching Ayr, the Whitlets roundabout should be reconfigured into a grade-separated interchange, which I proposed when traffic lights were first installed at this junction. However, this roundabout, as currently configured, is a most inelegant design and results in many minor accidents every year, and the time for a grade-separated interchange at this interchange is long overdue. Similarly, the A77 stretch south of the Whitlets roundabout through the Holmeston roundabout to the Bankfield roundabout, or the Hospital roundabout as it is known, is again needing to be upgraded to dual carriageway status, as there is significant congestion on this stretch of road at rush hour periods and on good summer days when many thousands of tourists visit the Ayrshire coast. And with climate change predicted to create still warmer and drier summers, visitors from central Scotland will, I hope, only increase in number and will be made most welcome to our Ayrshire coastline from Greenock to Ballantrae. Further growth in traffic on the A77 to the south of Ayr can be expected due to the Maybole bypass, which all of us welcome. My father campaigned for that between the two wars, so it took some time to come, but one has to be grateful to Adam Ingram for his persistence on that. But it's now being built, and as Maybole becomes a more attractive place to live in, and Kirkcoswald, Kirkmichael, Dalrymple, Cross Hill, Turnberry, Maidens, Daly and Girvan all become more accessible to Ayr, Kilmarnock and Glasgow. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I hope the Cabinet Secretary and others will have paid close attention to this debate today and the pressing needs for upgrades to the trunk roads of South West Scotland, as clearly expressed by all members today, with the notable exception of Joan McAlpine and Willy Coffey. I also note Willy Coffey said £800 million had been spent on South West Scotland roads in recent times, and I would really like to see the breakdown of these figures, because the projects he mentioned certainly didn't add up to £100 million, never mind £800 million. Presiding Officer.
I now call Paul Wheelhouse to respond to the debate. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd just say at the outset how much I welcome John Scott back at his place in this chamber, and good to see him looking well and contributing such an important debate for his constituency and those of many others in the chamber. Thank you, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to respond to today's members' debate on future options for transport infrastructure in South West Scotland. I do recognise many colleagues in the chamber today, including Mr Whittle, have taken a very long interest in this, and maybe not as long as John Scott, but certainly throughout his time in this Parliament, and Emma Harper, Joan McAlpine, Oliver Mundell, all have been very active in this space, as is Colin Smith as well. So I do recognise that and reflect that road transport plays such an important role in the local economy of the region I also represent. And I congratulate Mr Whittle for bringing this to the chamber today. Now, today's debate has given me an opportunity to hear more about the problems in other parts of the south of Scotland that I am less active in, and I concentrate largely in the east of the region, but deal with some casework in all across south west Scotland as well. But to add to the points that I receive in my own mailbag, it's been very helpful to hear some of the concerns that have been raised today about specific projects. There have obviously been contributions on the strategic importance of the ports of Cairnryan, and as we plan for the exit from the EU, I think it was fair, although I appreciate Mr Whittle predicted it, it was fair for colleagues to raise the issue of Brexit, and indeed as Willy Coffey, Joan McAlpine, Emma Harper have all raised just the current uncertainty about the arrangements with trade with Northern Ireland and the implications for the border do have a practical aspect to what would be required for investment in the region. But reassuringly, Presiding Officer, in all sincerity, many of the points raised today echo those raised by the wide range of stakeholders that have been involved in development of the South West Scotland Transport Study and its 23 recommendations. And I know the Cabinet Secretary is not here today, but I know the Cabinet Secretary has met and heard from a wide range of stakeholders over the last few years on these projects. I can assure members, as indeed the Cabinet Secretary stated at Portfolio Questions, that the Scottish Government recognises the important role that transport plays for those living and working in South West Scotland. We are also well aware of the significance of South West Scotland and its transport links, not only to the local economy, clearly, but to that of the rest of Scotland and the wider UK. And that's why we are taking steps to improve the transport network and will examine the 23 recommendations from the transport study as part of phase 2 of STPR2. And to answer Emma Harper's question, I'm anticipating that the second phase, which would be the phase of the STPR2 that we would be looking at, the specific recommendations, would be completed in 2021. So that gives a rough framework around the timescale for reaching conclusions about the projects that have been recommended. I'm very pleased to note the Scottish Government continues to invest in the region's road network. Colleagues have mentioned this already, but works are continuing as part of the £29 million construction contract for the A77 Maybole bypass, which will improve connectivity for road users between Stranraer, the port at Cairnryan and the Central Belt. And the project, as an example of investment in key routes to Cairnryan that Emma Harper was referencing, will help separate local traffic from traffic travelling further afield, which will lead to improved road safety for local communities and road users and provide better journey reliability for motorists and businesses along the full length of the A77. For the residents of Maybole themselves, this means a predicted reduction in traffic on the high street of approximately 50%, with the number of heavy goods vehicles estimated to be cut by 90%. And as a result, residents will see an improvement in road safety, a reduction in vehicle emissions and a significant drop in noise and vibration compared with what they experience today. We fully understand the importance of a safe, well-performing transport network for the health of Scotland's economy. The strategic road and rail certainly will.
Emma Harper.
He mentioned, thank you for taking an intervention, Minister. You mentioned the Maybole bypass, which I think has been estimated to be about £31 million. I'm sure Willy Coffey, who can't make an intervention here because he's remote, would be willing to submit the detail of the figures that he has suggested that John Scott was seeking clarification for. I wonder if the Minister would welcome that. It was based on a parliamentary question.
Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure, yes, sharing the parliamentary question would give the detail that Mr Willy Coffey has already obtained to help Mr Scott and others. And I think the figure we have for the Maybole bypass is 29 million. That's the figure I have, but just to give an accurate figure there. But we do, the strategic road and rail networks, we recognise are fundamental to the health of Scotland's economy and obviously the southwest of Scotland. And the motion highlights, and indeed Ms Harper and others have made a reference to this in their own speech, the A75 and A77 provide the key links to the ports at Cairnryan and are used daily for journeys to and from Northern Ireland for both freight and passengers. Many Scottish businesses in the South West we recognise and further afield rely on these transport links for goods and materials, and work in this area has highlighted issues around contingency in the event of an incident. And that said, we're clearly operating with an extremely challenging fiscal environment. And I would say to Oliver Mundell, who I do respect, that I think if I was listening to his speech, anybody would be forgiven for thinking he had ignored 10 years of public finance constraints emanating from the Treasury that we have had to live with. And that does make...
Excuse me, Minister, I have a point of order from John McAlpine.
Sure.
Point of order, John McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, for taking my point of order. I wanted to point out that John Scott said in his speech that I had not called for the upgrade of the road network. I did in my speech actually repeat my commitment to calling for dualling of the A75 and links between Dumfries and the Central Belt, and indeed the Transport Summit that has been mentioned by several speakers in the debate was actually called by myself, and I would appreciate if that could be put on the record that Mr. Scott has, put it politely, misrepresented my speech.
Well, as everyone knows, that's not actually a point of order, because things that are said in the chamber are for members to correct by intervention or afterwards. It's difficult when someone is remote to make an intervention. We know that can't happen. So I guess it's understandable that points of order are used in this way, and I'm sure everyone has taken notice. Thank you, Ms McAlpine, and back to Paul Wheelhouse. Thank
you, Presiding Officer. Indeed, I note Ms McAlpine's point. Indeed, actually, it helpfully prompts me to reference the point she made in her own speech just around the importance of evidence gathering, which I was trying to make, probably in a very clumsy way, actually, to Mr Mundell. That the importance of having the appropriate appraisal guidance followed so that we have economic evidence in place. Certainly,
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. If what he was saying was correct, why have major infrastructure projects been able to take place elsewhere in Scotland, and why didn't his government start this detailed work to scope out these important routes in the south of Scotland 13 years ago when it was first elected? Why has it waited till now?
Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In response to Mr Mundell, clearly there are very many long-term projects which have been commissioned in the lifetime of this Parliament, including the Borders Railway, a subject very close to my heart, which Ms Fabiani and others who've served since 1999 will know were projects that had to go through a very laborious process to come to fruition. And so it's not always as straightforward, perhaps, as Mr Mundell suggests. But what I would say to him is that all major capital projects require to go through the Treasury Green Book appraisal process, regardless of whether it's the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the UK Government. We're all bound by that. And you have to go through the rigour of the analysis to be able to justify the expenditure of public money. And I would hope all members would understand that and accept that. It's just it's not a point of contention, I hope, but just an explanation. It's not as quick sometimes as we would like it to be to force through projects. But we must obviously strive to support economic development in the South West with the wider economy of Scotland and to support our ambition for inclusive economic growth. Sorry, Presiding Officer.
John Scott.
I thank Mr Wheelhouse for giving way, but there does seem to be some lack of clarity around this £800 million. And given your competence, Mr Wheelhouse, which I admire constantly, I'm sure it will be easy for you to detail to me now where that £800 million has been spent in recent years, and just give me a flavour of all the projects on which that money has been spent on.
Paul Wheelhouse.
I hope if I proceed in my speech, make some reference to some examples, but I will write to Mr Scott with the detail of Mr Coffey's question and the detail.
I think we've probably had my patience tested far enough in this debate.
It would be helpful if I could make progress, Mr Mundell, and I can obviously speak to members after the debate if that would be helpful. But we are keen, obviously, to see that we support ambition for inclusive economic growth, while at the same time recognising the challenges that faces our country as a result of COVID-19 and climate change, which is, as many members will accept, I'm sure the advent of a climate emergency is making us look very closely at our strategic investments in transport to be consistent with that. But this does not mean building more capacity in road network is either the only or the best way To do this, and the National Transport Strategy and its vision and outcomes reflect the Government's economic and social priorities across 4 key themes around economy, equality, climate and health. And with that in mind, we're now working hard to deliver the second Strategic Transport Projects Review, while publication of the South West Scotland Transport Study in January, which was amongst the first regions. We're lucky the South West has been, alongside Scottish Borders, was in the front wave of areas having these studies undertaken to inform the Strategic Transport Project Review. An initial focus on the transport network in the South West has meant that I understand that a number of members have taken the opportunity to be involved directly as part of this study, and I would thank all of those who have for their involvement, which is very helpful. We'd also note that our stakeholder engagement programme is one of the most successful at type, with over 3,200 people having responded to the public survey, and the successful stakeholder events were delivered in Stranraer, Maybole, Dumfries, as well as sessions for local members in Dumfries and Ayr. And I would thank the public and stakeholders for their input to the study and assure them that all of their views have been considered in detail and have helped provide the most accurate picture possible of transport needs in the South West. Now, the survey and workshops focused on gathering evidence and problems and opportunities for the area, reinforcing knowledge we already had regarding the importance of access to the ports, the impact of freight on the network, and associated calls to improve the A75, A77 in particular, as we've heard today from members across the Chamber. And other key issues emerging included calls for improved integration between bus and rail services, calls to consider the impact of freight traffic on the road network and how this can be reduced, calls to address the lack of resilience in the road network when incidents do occur. And this work also highlighted issues with the passenger experience when using public transport in the area and ways in which the active travel network could be improved. The study's final 23 recommendations have been developed to address the key issues that have been raised, and they have been appraised against the specific regional transport planning objectives. And the study, published in January, forms a central part of the evidence base, referencing Joan McAlpine's comments, for the Strategic Transport Projects Review, by clearly defining potential transport improvements which meet transport planning objectives for the region, and these will, as the review now proceeds, be considered further as part of the Scotland-wide assessment of potential transport infrastructure investments and interventions. And in terms of the union connectivity study, which has been referenced by a number of members, this has been announced with virtually no consultation with the devolved administrations, despite transport having been a devolved responsibility since 1999. And the Cabinet Secretary has written jointly with his counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland to Grant Shapps, the UK Government Secretary for State for Transport. And this outlines the issues as we see them, and we await a detailed response. The Strategic Transport Projects Review is the process in Scotland for making recommendations on future transport investment in Scotland. That feeds directly into the Treasury approach that I outlined earlier. Any talk of a bridge to Ireland should clearly be set in the context of there being higher priorities, not just for the South West, but also for transport investment across Scotland. And that's been identified through the process. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, because I'm conscious of time, looking beyond the delivery of the Maybole bypass, our collaborative review of the National Transport Strategy has set the direction and vision for the kind of transport system we want for Scotland over the next 20 years. The South West study has provided the key evidence to support the second STPR and has clearly identified a range of options for improving transport in the South West. The South West is not a forgotten region. I appreciate people may feel that, but it is very much, I want to reassure you, not a forgotten region from the point of view of the Scottish Government. And now that work has restarted in SPR2, following a pause during the COVID-19 pandemic, we intend to take that phased approach I referenced earlier, reporting on the original planned timescale within this Parliament under Phase 1, focusing on locking in transport terms the positive benefits and travel behaviours of individuals arising through the pandemic, and provide a step change in investment which supports the priorities and outcomes of the NTS. And we currently envisage, as I say, we'll complete the second phase later in 2021. We remain committed to working positively and collaboratively with our local authority partners to deliver the strategic transport network fit and for post-COVID-19 era and beyond. I certainly can assure members that the transport network in the South West will be a key part of our considerations. And if I can, Presiding Officer, your patience, just with reference a couple of points, just to inform members. On Belfield, which I know is important to Mr Whittle, the report has recommended further work to be undertaken by East Ayrshire Council, and there has been some work, but we are waiting further findings from the Council on potential capacity limits that could be achieved with Belfield. And Ayr Station, there is a feasibility study now underway, led by Transport Scotland, which will include assessment of the hotel site. So I hope that's helpful to the member. But thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Our clerk had said to me, as long as we're finished for 10 to 8, we'll be fine, and I was starting to worry. So that concludes the debate. And I would remind everyone to observe social distancing when leaving the chamber, and this meeting is closed.